Alright, hello and welcome to a Period 6 overview video for the APUSH exam. Let's get started. Alright, all semester long we've been trying to answer the question of who's in charge, right, in terms of government authority, and I think Reconstruction finally answers that question once and for all. The second thing to think about now is who do we want to be? And that question emerges from the major changes that we see throughout, well, beginning in Period 6 at least. It's a transformation of the USA from an agrarian nation to a modernized urban and industrial powerhouse, and that includes the emergence of big business, the development of big cities, and big changes that came from immigration, as well as social reform that develops at the turn of the century. And again, all this happens relatively quickly. All right, let's not think about Reconstruction for a second, but instead focus on the economic direction of the country in the post-Civil War era. With the North and the West already united, great economic opportunity existed not only in developing the West, but in linking it back to the Northeast. Railroads become the first major corporation in a modern sense, and incidentally, their growth and development was largely encouraged and financed by the U.S. federal government. Remember that Uncle Sam offered the common man 160 acres of dry prairie, basically free of charge, and while many people took advantage of the 1862 Homestead Act, 5 times as much land was given to the railroad companies to link civilization and savagery. As this was the Gilded Age, corruption ran wild in government. A congressional scandal known as Credit Mobilier was linked to the railroad industry. Ulysses S. Grant's administration was also touched by a scandal with a whiskey ring. Urban centers were dominated by the fully corrupt yet early form of social welfare, political machines. While they used honest graft to profit heavily, they also gave back to the people at a time where federal aid to the poor and unlucky just did not exist. This is also a time where Americans truly believed in and identified with that upward mobility that was seen in the Horatio Alger stories, sort of the concept that one can go from rags to riches. Also remember that immigrant groups in the West, such as the Irish seen here and the Chinese, which were very instrumental in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, did not receive aid from these political machines as they existed in cities only. The pervasive belief in social Darwinism was used to justify the wealth that some had. The poor, therefore, were basically responsible for their own situation. And as I said before, they had a somewhat dogmatic belief in the Horatio Alger myth, and that inspired many wage earners and individuals to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and endure horrifically unsafe conditions for low pay and none of the basic rights that the employed enjoy today. But there was still a belief in this social gospel that many had, and that said that the wealthy, with their keen foresight and financial and intellectual talents, and their general good-hearted nature, should provide for the poor a ladder that is needed for one to climb up through the ranks. This is not a handout, but instead it included facilities and institutions such as libraries and universities that the poor may take advantage of to improve their lot. Urban workers, however, with their long hours and grueling conditions, were not necessarily in a position to take evening classes after the 10 to 12-hour shift in the factory. Oddly enough, urban wage earners and rural frontier farmers shared much in common in terms of the quality of life that they had. While somewhat overly idealistic, it's safe to say that rural Americans, for the time being at least, had their land to fall back on. Urban workers, and this is much more distinct due to the strong sense of nativism that existed in America at this time, were seen as interchangeable. If you're injured on the job or associated with such radical ideas as socialism, then you're really out of luck in the city. Instead of a soddy on the frontier, you lived in a tenement apartment, which itself promoted such a low standard of living that you and I simply could not endure it. Also, as an immigrant, you're in many ways treated as an outsider. The solution that immigrants had to this problem was to settle into ethnic enclaves, formerly known as ghettos. Despite the similarities between rural and urban American workers, the two took very different routes to promoting their personal interests. Farmers would develop groups such as the Grange, and later the Farmers' Alliance, to discuss common problems and cooperate to solve this problem. They also had a social component to it, but this evolved into the populist movement, a political party that supported many things that would help keeping the working classes afloat. Free coinage of silver, for example, would promote inflation and help farmers who were in debt. The direct election of senators would also remove corruption from the upper house, and a graduated income tax would be more fair for everyone. Urban wage earners turned to the labor union to promote the interests of city workers. Collective action such as this was often labeled as socialist and communist. These radical political beliefs associated with labor unions were also conveniently attached to immigrant groups that were now arriving in the U.S. in large numbers. Throughout the 19th century, several clashes between labor unions and local, state, and federal governments occurred. Moving away from the people and onto the business class, tremendous financial gains were made throughout the Gilded Age by those who possessed capital. Business leaders sought to increase profits by consolidating businesses into trusts, which would develop monopolies. And they weren't technically breaking any laws at the time, but they were operating without any concern for the well-being of their competition. The amount of capital which they came to possess was so large that you can make the case that they didn't just monopolize industries, they in fact monopolized capital. And with that capital, they came to influence government greatly, thereby restricting the power of legislation such as the Interstate Commerce Act and later the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. Those were in fact very weak and oftentimes not able to attack corporations and trusts such as U.S. Steel and Standard Oil, and instead they were often used to check the power of radical labor unions. Continued economic growth was spurred on by several imperialist goals. First in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, and then continued throughout the Filipino insurrection. Uncle Sam loosened his belt a little bit as the nation grew beyond our continental boundaries. This very movement of imperial growth and the desire to expand and not expire actually promoted nationalism during a time of internal strife and conflict. However, a new resistance would emerge, not based on sectionalism, but on the very notion that the U.S. had lost its way. This anti-imperialist league, with members such as William Lloyd Garrison, Andrew Carnegie, and Mark Twain, questioned the true nature of American influence abroad. The government may have used such arguments such as social Darwinism and the white man's burden, as well as a desire for new raw materials and markets for our manufactured goods. To a lesser extent, of course, there was a desire for the liberation and protection of free individuals against their oppressors, although that was often tied towards continued national and specifically economic growth. American foreign policy at the turn of the century can be compared to the European imperial goals which preceded it. Clearly, by 1914, the USA was in fact on par with its friends across the pond. The inability to avoid World War I and the attempt of Woodrow Wilson to help shape the post-war era is clear evidence of a new global role for the United States. Period 6 also includes the Indian Wars. The close of the 19th century saw the close of the frontier and the virtual end of Native American culture as it was prior to European contact. This series of armed conflicts culminated with the massacre at Wounded Knee in December of 1890. Progressive-minded reformers began to rally around the idea of kill the Indian to save the man, and created Indian boarding schools such as the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. Here Native children were assimilated and forced to adopt white culture. The end of resistance in the West allowed for continued and rapid growth, as can be seen here in these two images of Deadwood, South Dakota. Well, that's it for Period 6. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this helped. Best of luck in May.